Hello, everybody. This is James Diboe and Discovering, dedicated to original peoples as always. And we got a special guest on. He's been on before, he's been on twice. This is a third time back. Professor Smalls, how you doing, my brother? Great to have you back. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James. I'm glad to be back here. I believe you're doing tremendous, important work, spreading the word on Africa and the African diaspora. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to be part of it.
Thank you very much. We need people like yourself on anyway, especially people like yourself who've gone so far, into the United States, places like Brazil, and many other places. And, it's a greeting, and I'm very privileged to have you on, and especially for the third time. So thank you very much for your time. Now, today, we're going to discuss your new book. Now, it came out in June. It came out in June.
That's right.
I've just got a couple of questions if we could speak on the book. So the book is called Shadows of the Big House, Antebellum Slave Cabins, Heritage Tourism in Louisiana. Now, what is the book about? If we could start with that first, please. Want to know what this book's about.
Okay. I can tell you what it's about. So I've been studying heritage museums across the US for the last 20 years. And all of the museums, the heritage sites that I go to, they're all based in buildings that used to be part of plantations of the enslaved. And I go to these sites to see how do they talk about history? What do they say about slavery? And what do they say about Black people? And mainly, it's an academic book, but it has important messages. And the underlying issue for me, my motivation is who controls history? Who writes the history of the US, of Britain, of European colonialism and slavery? What do they say? And how do Black people and other people challenge them? So this book is based on research that I did in Louisiana, which was one of the largest states for enslavement. And Louisiana produced 90% of sugar on the backs of Black people working in sugar plantations in a subtropical climate. So I went to Louisiana, and the reason I went to this particular site, the town is called Natchitoches. It's about 5 hours from New Orleans. And I went there because they have 3 plantation heritage sites. And these 3 sites have 16 so-called slave cabins. And I wanted to know, what do they say about these slave cabins? Black people were the majority on all of these plantations, but white people get the most attention. So the book asks, what are these plantations? What is the history of how they exploited and brutalized Black people? How did Black people respond? And most importantly, what do these sites say today? I spent several summers between 2007 and 2014. I've continued. So it's really, what happens at the sites today? There's some history, but it's mainly about who controls history today? What do they say? And so the book describes the sites, it describes what they say, and they're the main goals.
Interesting. And it's funny when you explain about who controls history. It's like I've just come back from Egypt and I was speaking to some Egyptologists, different peoples. And what I did enjoy is the ones I came across were quite open-minded, which these weren't the typical Egyptologists that we see, the most popular ones. And they were quite open to discussion on different things like possibilities of different migrations that went to Egypt from different parts of Africa. And I will be having some of them on my show soon, which I was happy that they were open for discussion. So in your area of research and some of the people that you came across, have you found some of these open to discussion, or are they very narrow-minded and they don't want to change anything that is found, anything new information, or are they just sticking to the old style of research, would you say?
Well, look, as you can imagine, there's a wide variety of people and a wide variety of perspectives. So there's a lot of people who say, look, we are not going to discuss Black people's lives. We are not going to discuss where they lived and what they did. Those people are narrow-minded and bigoted. Some of them are brainwashed because they think America is so great, like they think Britain is so great. And some of them just don't care. The honest truth, James, is I just ignore those people. I don't have time for them. Some people challenge them, but I don't have time for them. What I want to do is, like yourself, work with people who are open to looking at the truth, to looking at an accurate history. I'm ready to work with people who acknowledge that the history we have is biased, partial, distorted, in the favor of white people. I mean, let's be blunt. That's how it is. And so what I've found at these sites is more and more people are receptive. Now, I began research in the US in Louisiana and Georgia and Virginia in the 1990s, and they were a lot more closed-minded. But the truth is, Black people have been pushing them and challenging them, you know, some non-Black people too. So they've become a bit more open. But a lot of it is superficial. They might say they still spend a lot of the time focusing on white people. Let me give you an example. So in my book, I look at these 3 plantations and these 3 heritage sites. They all talk about slavery. They all talk about enslaved people. They mention men and women. But the fact is, and they are far better than most of the sites across the US. But the truth is that Black people still get the secondary attention compared to elite white people. At these heritage sites, elite white people, you hear about their hopes and dreams, their hobbies, where they grew up, what they did, what they achieved, what kind of clothes they wore, what kind of furniture, all of that you hear about their names. They are humanized and personalized. Excuse me. With Black people, you don't get that kind of information. They mention, oh, they were enslaved. Yes, they did contribute, and so on. So that's the fact. So some change, but not enough. However, at one of these heritage sites, which is called Melrose Plantation, there's a Black woman called Clementine Hunter. She was what you call a folk artist, and that woman painted thousands of paintings and crockery and different things. And when you look at her work, you see the challenge. Whereas the heritage sites put white people first, Clementine Hunter puts Black people first. Whereas the white sites don't talk about suffering and struggling and brutality, Clementine Hunter talks about working in the fields, working on a plantation. Whereas the white sites don't name Black people, Clementine Hunter names Black people. Black people are first and foremost in her paintings. And as I say, she's produced. Now, the site mentions some of them, but they treat it at the marginal. So you have to, you have to look beyond their narrative, their history, because they control history, and look at what Black people are saying and doing. And in these images, so for example, she's got a very basic strategy that I like. In her paintings, all the Black people are big and all the white people are small. And I'm like, hey, it's simple because they were more important. In her paintings, the Black women are painted big and the Black men are painted small because she said Black women don't get enough attention. So what we see here is no matter what white people and elites do to control history, Black women and men are always challenging it. I've seen it in Louisiana. We've seen it in Liverpool with the museums. We've seen it in Amsterdam. And so that's the message I take away, that no matter what they do, we refuse to be silent.
Great. And it's funny you mentioned about not wasting time with some of these academics, because some academics I've spoke to, they're always speaking on we must be able to challenge in their arenas, for example, where if it's like everything is one-sided, if it's about just proving your research, that's fine. But if it's about Eurocentric ideologies and we're in the minority in that room or in that discussion, I believe it's sometimes just a waste of time. But I know some of us have got to do this, but I believe that it's best to connect with those with an open mind, because we're just leading ourselves down this tunnel vision, which they're trying to keep us in.
Hey.
Definitely.
Why should we keep banging our head against the wall? We spend so much time challenging their racism.
Yeah.
We don't get to focus on our priorities, and our priorities are Black people, Black voices, what were Africans doing? This from your work on Africa. We didn't get that kind of information in school. We got more information about Africa from reggae music, from 10 songs, than we did from 10 years in a Liverpool school. So look, Some people have to do it. I encourage them. I support them. Some people have a better bandwidth. But as I've gotten older, I'm like, look, I want to work with people who are open-minded, who are progressive, and who are looking at the truth in history. Okay. Well, let me say one thing. Some people say to me, why are you wasting your time with museums? Why do you spend time looking at these statues when there are other bigger issues? And I say, look, there are other bigger issues. I know about police violence and unemployment and health. It's important, and a lot of people are looking at them. But it's also important that some people look at these museums, because these museums claim to tell the truth about history. And in my research, what I found out is that people that go to museums, they seem to believe what they say more than what they hear in schools. And so these museums, in simple terms, are brainwashing people's minds.
Yeah.
In more complex terms, they're telling stories that are inaccurate, that are exclusive, that don't focus on Black people, that are not comprehensive. And therefore, we need to look at these. Let me tell you how I got involved. Look, growing up in Liverpool, I never thought I'd study museums. Museums had nothing for me in Liverpool. As far as I was concerned, in the 70s and 80s, museums in Liverpool had everything to be ashamed of and nothing to be proud of. And then the Atlantic Slave Trade Gallery got started. They wanted to focus on slave trade. Black people opposed it. We said, we want to focus on Africa. Angus Chukwuemeka and the Merseyside African Council said, why is the first gallery at this museum focusing on the slave trade? We want to focus on African civilizations. So these are the reasons I got involved. Another reason is that at some of the earlier meetings, Black women in Liverpool, some men too, but mainly Black women, said, look, our children go to these museums and they see naked African women. They see men with bones in their noses, all this kind of racist nonsense that they're ramming down our children. So these are some of the reasons. The final issue I want to mention is when British politicians and the press and school teachers talk about the so-called achievements of Britain, I believe it's all based on a very narrow, partial history. They focus on what they call civilization, Christianity, culture. Yeah. But I have a good friend, and I think you spoke to him recently, Professor Adekiye Adebajo, and he said, look, the Europeans may claim they were involved in commerce and Christianity and culture, but the truth is they were really involved in plunder and profit and prestige.
Yeah.
And so, we continue to challenge them. I'm glad to say that in my life, I've seen some significant changes. Not as much as we'd like to see, but certainly far more than we had in the past. So for me, museums are an important issue in terms of who controls history, who gets to write history. And that's why they should take some of our attention. Not most of our attention, but some of our attention.
Interesting. I mean, I was at the Museum of Luxor. I was at the New Cairo Museum in Egypt. And I try my best to, I understand that just because it's in a museum, it doesn't mean it's 100% accurate. But we've got to find the best of what we can find, what they allow us to see. Anything that's the most important things, like, for example, I was looking at ancient writing. And I noticed that in the museums, the dates are a little bit better. Like, an example, I was looking at the first script that was written in Egypt, and it was in the 4th millennium BC. Now, a script, obviously, that's the beginning of any writing system. Later on, 3250 BC, writing, it comes out. But if you just read on normal sites, it doesn't really go to 3250 BC. You bring it down a little, more modern, even if they knock it down a couple of 100 years. But I was happy to see better dates in the museums, in the Cairo Museum. Now, there's other things like looking at some of the mummies, for example, and looking at the features of some of them. When they had that thing where they were saying the Egyptians were white people, Eurasian people.
That's right.
It was interesting seeing some of them with the dreadlocks still. And I was really happy to see that. And also, I'm not a person who's ever examined skulls, craniums, but I've got a very good eye for it. I've got a very good eye looking at craniums. And I could see a lot of African craniums, particularly Kushite, Nilo-Saharan, And also recognizing as well that, yes, not every single thing will be 100% accurate, but I've seen some great things there that can open up discussions on moving forward, basically. And speaking to some of the Egyptologists, which some of them, they were open-minded, but they were only open-minded until I mentioned a lot of different things. What I was mentioning is when we're dealing with the pharaohs of Egypt, the earliest pharaohs, the contributions to a lot of different Africans. It wasn't even like one set of Africans who were pharaohs. There's many different Africans. And this is before any Eurasian people came in, poured into Egypt. So they've asked me to send them some information. So I'm going to send them a lot of information. Then I'm going to get them on the show. And then we're going to see what we can work with. Because like they said to me in a positive light, they're willing to learn as much as possible. And we're all still learning in this research, especially dealing with stuff like ancient Kemet and stuff. It's more things coming out every day. So
yes,
as long as people are willing to take on new research, revisiting history, I think this is something that we've got to do all the time.
that's right.
So just like yourself, it's you've gone so far and you're still digging deep on history, which definitely we all appreciate. And
Good. Back
to the book.
Thanks, James.
After that, anyway, I want to. If you want to finish up what you're saying, I'm going to get back to your book. Sorry.
Yeah, we'll get back to that in a minute. Well, look, what you're doing, I think, is indispensable to challenging who controls history, visiting Egypt, visiting these other countries, looking at what's on display, finding people who are ready to engage in dialogue. And you're here now sharing your experiences. You're in Liverpool, you were just in Egypt, I'm in California. This is part of the comparison that we're trying to motivate people. We won't win everybody over, but we want to win over more people than ever before. Raise questions. And, you talk to a lot of people in Liverpool. You've had a lot of people on your show, a lot of people watching, and they're questioning these issues, and we're getting more and more information. So I think, that's the way to go forward. And I have my priorities, and I'll tell you what my priorities are in a minute when we come back to some of the questions.
Okay. Yes, so back to the book, what we were talking about anyway. Another question I want to ask is, why did you write the book? And what kind of research have you found, have you done within the book? What kind of research have you done to get deeper into writing the book?
Okay. Well, it was all happened by chance. It's what I call a provocation and an opportunity. So as I said, I never planned to write about museums, but when Peter Moores donated money to the museum in Liverpool to have a museum on slavery, that's when I really got to address the issue of who controls history, who writes history, who decides what information is there. So I was a member of the Confederation of Black Organizations. I work with the museum. I work with multiple people. Dave Clay has described some of this in his very important book, Black Liverpool, 100 Years. He describes some of the things. And this is, again, important to our history in Liverpool. So what happened then is I relocated to the US, and I was in Georgia in 1996. And you know what was happening? It was the Olympics. And the state of Georgia was trying to find ways. They knew millions of people are coming, and they were trying to find ways to keep people in the state. So they were promoting discussion of Southern plantation, heritage tourism, and Gone with the Wind. And so I was shocked to find out that there are all these plantations that are now museums. I was astonished to find out that they said little or nothing about Black people, that they had nothing about Black people's lives. So I said, look, I just got vexed. I said, this is not right, that kind of thing. So I said, I want to research and find out what just the idea that there are hundreds of museums that are based in so-called slave plantations. So for me, I saw it as a way, again, I come back to who controls history, who has the resources, what kind of information do they use? Now, when I look at these museums and these heritage sites, most of the evidence was left by white people, but there's a lot of information left by Black people. There's a lot of folk tales. There's a lot of oral history. There's a lot of material history that we can find, and they tell very different stories. So, for example, in one of these heritage sites, the documents, the white people say, no, our slaves were very happy. They were well fed. They trusted us and so on. But when you do archaeology, you see that black people hid things in the ground. They had that, the white people said, our slaves are all Christians. But when you look at African symbols in the so-called slave cabins, you look at things that the whites said they stole. So you get very different histories when you focus on that. So that's how I got involved in it. But some people say to me, oh, you're a museum specialist. I say, look, I'm not a museum specialist. It's not how I think about myself. I use museums to explore who controls history, who has the resources, who decides. And that brings me to education. So here's how I would phrase it. For me, a focus on museums, whether in California, whether in Louisiana or England, a focus on museums is an end in itself, but it's also a means to an end. So as an end in itself, museums, we need to look at what do they say? What's their research? Like statues, why are they there? Why do white people continue to praise and glorify white men that brutalized and exploited and assaulted black women and men? So I want to look at the museums, but museums as an end in itself is not the main thing for me. The main thing for me is how do museums serve as a means to another end, to raise issues around education, to raise issues around resources, to raise issues around priorities. And in general, what I say when I look at these museums is most black people, I believe, and people can challenge me, they want to hear the truth, but changing museums is not their priority. What I think black people in Liverpool and Louisiana and elsewhere, what they want is we want an end to racism. We want an end to denying us our humanity. We want an end to denying us our respect. We want resources so we can pursue our priorities. So museums, education, knowledge, who writes history, they all, for me, are a means to an end, which is about social change, about empowering black people. And, that's the fight that we're in. And black people know this. This is the fight we've always been in. Some people say to me, how do we change everything? How do we improve everything? I said, look, we do what we've always done, which was we continue to challenge. We continue to equip ourselves. They know that already. You don't need a PhD to figure that out. That other people know it. So definitely. I'm looking right now. I'm working with a number of people in Liverpool. I'm ready to work with institutions. I'm in dialogue with the University of Liverpool. I'm on a committee. I'm in dialogue with the museum. I'm in dialogue with people at Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, people who are receptive, and some of them are. Okay. But I'm also in dialogue with a lot of young black people and others in Liverpool who have other priorities, who have other goals. And I want to encourage them. I don't have to agree with everything they say. I just want to support people and people like yourself who are doing important work and spreading the word.
Appreciate that, because at the end of the day, we had this discussion last time about sometimes you can meet people with PhDs and they're not open to discussion, especially when you bring up anything like indigenous knowledge, and especially when you just brought it before.
Indigenous knowledge.
Oral history. Now, oral history seems to really not get taken serious. But one thing about oral history is even before whether there was a writing system, this is something that's been intact for thousands of years, passed down, parent to child. So to be honest, it's actually more reliable to a degree. Obviously, writing is definitely something that it was a great invention, but oral history cannot be dismissed. And I think another thing is one thing is meeting indigenous peoples. I do my research, but at the same time, I'll go out and I'll take far drives, whether it's in Asia, Africa, Australia, Pacific, South America, wherever I've got to go to get that knowledge. Speak to the people, and I'll make comparative studies. I'll see what matches up and what doesn't match up. And we get this thing of with indigenous knowledge, we get the truth when we speak to them, but we also, from the Eurocentric side, they create a lot of spookism. It's all spookism. They were devil worshippers. They really just trying your best to put us off them. But and then when you listen to the same people, these are the same people who've imposed slavery on these people. They've disturbed nice, peaceful, natural villages where people were not about Abraham's religions. And, even if they do take it on, it's still because I've seen people taking it on also in the Philippines, Christianity, but at the same time, the Etta tribe will still keep their traditions, whether or not some of them will take on modern day religions. But fair enough, it's each their own. But I think the main thing is preserving your culture, which has been existing through the beginning of time. And this is what I'm about, trying to connect. And like I said last time, I do believe they see it as a threat, indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is so pure, when it comes to healing people, how they connect to nature. You might even see some of them talking to a tree, but they believe every living thing has a soul. And that's what I mean. Some things are too deep to people to have these kind of discussions. So, like I say, I had to have a lot of courage in myself to open these discussions up and speak on them on podcast or speak to them, whatever, anyone, academics, to average person. And some people are good at engaging into this, and some people are really dismissive, which I'm sure you've seen yourself.
That's right. Yeah, we've seen that. Look, nobody in Liverpool schools mentioned indigenous knowledge when we were growing up. You're a different generation from me, but I believe that's true. And they don't respect indigenous knowledge. And we have to challenge that. They're not just going to give it up because they have the resources, they have the power, the authority, and so on. I have colleagues here at my university who are open to this. We have a folklore program. We have a Native American Studies program. In my institute that I direct, there's a Center for the Study of Native Americans. Great. And I have colleagues who go to Latin America and also to Africa looking at indigenous knowledge. And so this information is coming out. We're fighting against the bigger resources, but we're not going to give up. Our resource, they have financial resources, but our resource is determination, motivation, stamina, perseverance. So indigenous knowledge will rise. Similarly, you've seen this in Africa. I was in South Africa this summer, and some of the meetings I would have, they're doing more and more work on indigenous knowledge. And there's not just one type of indigenous knowledge. There's multiple types. In South Africa, there are 11 official languages. So that will accumulate. And I regret that the racism of Liverpool schools denied me the opportunity to look at those various perspectives. And here's one of the contradictions. I would even go so far as to call it the hypocrisy of British education. They claim they are open to all kinds of knowledge, that they are impartial, that they are unbiased. But when you start to raise these questions, they just close down. Most of them, not all of them. There are people who are receptive. And we've seen some of those changes. So the issue, as I think you'll agree, is to be aware that what we see in schools and universities is not the only type of knowledge. It's not the most important type of knowledge. And there are other kinds of knowledge which are just as important, just as fundamental. Okay. Let me tell you what my priority is. I want to mention two things. I think we're going to run out of time, but we'll start again. But I want to mention two things. I've been looking more and more at imperialism, the period from the 1880s to 1950s and Liverpool. And I've all my life, that's point number one. Point number two is, all my life, I've focused on what do Black people have to say in different periods at different times, what kind of information, what kind of knowledge. Okay. And imperialism is important for me because it brings together far more information about Black people. During slavery, Black people left documents and information, but not a great deal. But during imperialism, once slavery was abolished, but racism didn't end, Black people were far more able in the US, in the West Indies, in Africa, far more able to read and write, build institutions. So we have far more information from Pan-Africanists, from African nationalists who rejected, Eurocentrism. And so what I've been doing over the last 5 or 6 years, or a bit more, is looking more and more at who are the Black people that came to Liverpool from the West Indies, from the United States, from Africa. And the important thing is, and there's several books by my friend and colleague Hakeem Addy, who's the foremost professor of African history in Britain. And he points out that all the people, all the important Africans, West Indians, Afro-Americans that came to England, to London, they all came through Liverpool. Almost every single one of them, from the 1850s and 60s. And I'll give you some names in a moment. So one of the things I think should be a priority in Liverpool is Let's identify all these black people in these different periods, men and women. When did they come to Liverpool? What did they do? What did they say? What kind of information? What kind of knowledge? What kind of exchange? And there's a large number of them. You wouldn't know it from school books. Okay. Now, Liverpool University, first they denied they were connected to slavery. That was foolish. Now they've admitted, and now they've contributed money. They've contributed, as far as I understand, less than £200,000. It's not a great deal. But my problem is that they're spending that money to examine the history of Liverpool University and slavery. And I'm like, listen, we already know Liverpool University was racist. And maybe it will be useful to find out more about what kind of racism and what kind of belief. But that's not going to help black people particularly. Yeah. And I argue that it would be far better if they spent the money documenting black people's lives, enabling black people and others in Liverpool who have knowledge and insight and experience, like yourself, to write the history of black people. Who was here? What did they say? What did they do? For me, it's a simple method of decolonizing the mind. Let's find out more and more about what black people had to say, who was here, what did they do, what kind of connections did they have. For me, that's an important step, is bringing out more and more information, more and more black voice. I mean, it's kind of obvious. You'd think it's kind of self-evident, right? Yeah. But they're not doing it. And I think they are responsive. I think if we raise this issue more and more, I think they're going to do it. You know, Malik Al-Nasir.
Yeah, I spoke to them last time on my show. If I can ask a question as well, sort of you brought up something before, and I want to add on to it. You know, statues, the statues. You remember like a few years ago, the statues were getting pulled down. Now, when the statues are being pulled down, some people were in favour of statues being pulled down, some people were not. How do you feel about the statues? And another thing as well, plaques. Some of these plaques cost a lot of money. Now, do we look at the plaques as a form of reparations, or should the money be spent on things that could benefit us a lot more? How do you feel about the plaques and the statues? I've just seen your opinion on it.
Okay. Look, I'll tell you, and I want to discuss with you. I just wrote a chapter in a book on the William Ewart Gladstone statue, which is at the back of St. George's Hall. And I'm going to send you a copy of that chapter. Okay. And again, my position is simple. I can make things complicated. I'm an academic, but that's not my life. As I always say, look, I was black a long time before I was an academic. So here's my position. Statues are an end in themselves, and they're a means to an end. Yeah. So we are angry that we have all these statues. We have to walk past them every day. We live in their shadows of these elite white men that brutalized, violated, exploited black people. I mean, that's the truth. Okay. So we need to address them. Okay. Should they be removed? Should they be pulled down? Should plaques? I'm open to discussion. Yeah. I don't think I'm inclined to remove them, because I think, they shouldn't be left as they are, as if they're just glorified. Yeah. I'm not inclined to remove them. However, plaques are not enough for me. I think there should be more information. Well, look, let me contradict myself. I would be okay removing them and putting them in a museum. As you know, the Huskisson statue is gone from Princess Avenue. Yeah. And there's some information there that describes it. I can live with that. But the most important thing to me would be to hear from a range of black people in Liverpool what they're discussing, and what they propose. So that's the statues. But more importantly for me, the question is statues as a means to an end. And in my chapter, what I write is, look, black people, it's not been our priority. We knew the damn statues were there. Yeah. City elders like Eric Lynch and Angus Chukwuemeka and Joey Joel Sr. and Geraldine Ambrosius, Jimmy, they told us, but we were living our lives and trying to get away from the violence of skinheads and the racism. So we know they were there, okay? But they're not our priority. Our priority has always been to access resources, to end police violence, to end racism. So the statues for me, because there's a focus on them, I'm more interested in what questions did they raise? And again, they raise questions for me about who controls history, who has the power to put these statues there, who has the power to prevent us from removing these statues, what kind of resources are made available. Do I consider plaques reparation? It's a tiny step. It's a tiny step. Not even a step, not even a toddler step.
Yeah.
Am I glad to see it? Yes, because I think the more that people see these things, the more we'll motivate people, progressive people, to challenge them. But just putting a plaque and saying, okay, now we've done reparations. No, it's nonsense. We're against it. We're against it.
Yeah.
Do I want to see more plaques like the Black Siemens, the merchants that Joe Farag and many other people have put in Falkner Square? Yes, I want to see that. Do I want to see plaques to Eric Lynch? Yeah, but it's the first step, a small but significant step. Not minor, small but significant step. And I'm looking for giant strides. So I want to see more information about what's in the museums, what's being done. And if somebody pushed me, if you were to push me to say, look, Stephen, you've only got one proposal, what would it be? My proposal would be provide the Black community with resources so we can achieve our priorities. It's simple.
Definitely. Whether it's more jobs, some more beneficial.
Yeah, resources so people can go to college.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I'm really happy with that. Yeah.
One other thing also is this obsession with credentials. We have a lot of Black people in Liverpool that have knowledge, experience, insights, but they don't have PhDs, but they have more information than PhDs.
Yeah.
So I'm saying let's equip people. You know who they are. You're one of them yourself. You have credentials. You've got knowledge, but you apply for a job. They say, oh, no, you have to have a PhD. Yeah. I know people, one of the reasons people like me is I've got a PhD and I'm actively.
Yeah.
So well, it's going to cut off. Are we going to come back?
Yeah. We'll come back anyway. Okay. We'll hold it there, and we'll come back to this. Yeah. Okay. So we're back to where we are. That's going to continue this, and just like to show the yank, and we can continue as we're saying.
Nice.
Interesting. Yeah.
And it's good, James, it's important to bring these physical material objects to show them reality rather than, books are important, but the actual travel combined with the knowledge is very important too. So I believe in that. I have a lot myself. Look, I got this one. I don't know if you can see.
Oh, yeah.
It's not so. I got this one.
Beautiful. Amazing.
I'll send you the photograph.
Yeah. Key to life, And
I keep it close, to remind me.
That's it, and you just feel that, like, connected more to the ancestors by having these kind of things, But back to what we were saying anyway. We'll get back to the book.
Okay.
And what we were saying about the book was basically, we were mentioning about the book, the connection with Louisiana and Liverpool. What would be the connections?
Okay. So there's a couple of things briefly. The first thing is that during the so-called Civil War, Louisiana planters who owned enslaved people, many of them moved into Texas and some of them moved into Mexico. And why is that relevant? Because to escape from Abraham Lincoln's troops, they sent their cotton through Texas and Mexico to Liverpool. As you know, Liverpool aided and abetted the Confederacy. And so I have a colleague recently retired, David Montejano. He's writing a book on how Louisiana planters used Texas and Mexico to send cotton to Liverpool. We already know some things, but this hasn't been revealed. So that's one connection. But the more important connection, I think, for Black people in Liverpool is that looking at Louisiana, looking at the US, it reminds us that we are not alone, that Black people continue to challenge this biased, distorted history, that even though, white people and white institutions continue to tell us partial things, we don't accept it. We've always been inspired in Liverpool by Black Americans, by Africans, by West Indians. So again, it's a reminder that the struggle continues. La lucha continua, as they say in Spanish. The struggle continues. We can get motivation. We can get inspiration. The other thing is, I focused in my book, I mainly focus on these three sites, but I also mentioned, look, there are a lot of other museums, African-American museums, African-American managed museums, and they tell very different stories. They give you concrete information about how we can represent Black people, how we can represent Black women. We don't have to show them naked all the time. And when you go to these Black museums, and I give examples in the book, for example, in the museums I visit, organized and owned by white people, you never hear the word rape. They never say it. But in Black museums, they confront it. It's a reality. It's unpleasant. It's harsh, but it's a reality. In the white museums, you will never see a Black man with a gun. But in Black museums, they say, look, Black people had guns and they fought and they challenged. So it's a very different narrative. So there's concrete information. And you can see that despite the difference in resources, Black people continue to resist. So that's why that's why I think it's important, to get that comparative information, to get those insights, and to get concrete examples. I work with museums in Brazil and in Curacao. There's a museum in Curacao called the Tula Museum, Tula. And Tula was an enslaved person who resisted, who organized a rebellion. The Dutch absolutely brutalized him. It was almost sadistic. But Black people in Curacao have created this museum. They tell a very different story, and they continue to challenge. So these comparisons give us, insight, inspiration. And for me, they motivate us to continue to fight on.
Yeah, if I could just mention something funny, you just said that in Black museum, they'll show Black people who had access to guns. Now, in white museum, they don't show any Black people with guns. Now, just funny enough, you mentioned that, because what I found with a lot of research from white academics is that they don't like showing anything of a rebellion from us. If you look in history, what people have they ever said, African people or Black people, whatever we are being able to conquer another nation? They've only talked about we've conquered ourselves through tribalism, just like you see on the corners of the streets in wherever you are today. Black on Black crime. Now, they don't mind discussing about the Black on Black crime or Black on Black tribalism. So it makes you start to think that the worst thing they could imagine is any kind of uprising, rebellion, just like you had the Haitian Revolution or you had any kind of uprising. It's like we're told that we can't conquer another nation and we can only conquer each other. But listen to people like Dr. John Hendrik Clark, who spoke about a time when, in the earliest times of civilization, Africans ruled over other nations. But these are things that can't get discussed because we have to look like the victim and can only be conquered. But the only people they say we can conquer is ourselves, whether it's tribalism, whether it's Black on Black crime.
I get it. Look.
Yeah.
I agree with you. Look, we know, we're making these generalizations. We know it's not every single white person. We're not blaming every single. There are some exceptions. But the overall trend, the way you describe it is true. And the way I would describe it, particularly in England, the strategy in England is silence, evasion, euphemism, marginalization. So when you say these things to people, they say, no, we've got one example over there. And I say, but you have 500 books in your library written by white people who are all racist.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me give you another example. The difference between, I've been to 150 of these museums across the US, 100 at least, and every single one of them used to be a slave plantation. Listen to this. It will get you vexed.
Yeah.
You will never, in any of these museums, hear about a so-called bad slave master. Every museum you go to, they say, oh, our slave master was good. I'm like, it's complete nonsense. It's complete nonsense. So the idea that everything is okay is gross exaggeration. It's a hallucination.
And let me bring up about South America.
We know there is some exception.
I just want to say something about South America. Funny enough, South America.
Go ahead.
It's funny.
I'm learning from you.
It's funny you mentioned before about what they class as rape, and they don't really go into that. But in Latin America, they more wash it over, even more felt that they were talking about the relationships with the Black women and the Native American women with the European, Spanish or Portuguese men. And they kind of described it as if they were in a great relationship. It was more of a relationship than it was rape without consent, so
Exploitation or abuse.
exploitation. Yeah, but you can get away with that a bit more because maybe a lot of us don't speak Spanish, Portuguese, but like yourself, you speak these
Yeah,
languages, so you can get even further
that's right.
into it.
And that's
So,
right. And there's more of a challenge. There's more people coming through. But, they have this nonsense. They have this phrase in Portuguese and in Spanish. It translates into English as benign colonialism. It's an oxymoron. It's a total contradiction.
yeah,
And they represent all these so-called brown-skinned women as if they volunteered and were happy to be involved in the relationship. Black women did what they needed to do to survive, to
yeah,
raise their family, to do
yeah,
what they can achieve. And I see phrases, it does get me angry. I see phrases in academic books where they say it started in exploitation, but it ended in love, as
yeah,
if that could be true. And as if that could, and I'm not talking about them, I'm talking about academics today. So we still have a fight on our hands, but I do feel more motivated, inspired now than, 34 years ago. So we continue to challenge them. So I'm glad you raised Latin America. There's far more going on there that we don't know about, and we
yeah,
shouldn't base our work only on the US. The US is important, but it's not the only area, and it's not representative of the Americas.
yeah. So anyway, you wanted a little discussion just before, or did you want to discussion afterwards? It was just on
Well,
what's
look,
to go on.
let me say two things before I finish. Then I want to have a private discussion with you. I want to build our relationship and develop some things in Liverpool.
Yeah,
So we'll turn that off. But let me say two things again. I just want to emphasize the need and my priority to build on the work of slavery and focus on imperialism.
yeah,
Slavery was legally abolished in the British Empire in the 1830s. But when we focus on imperialism, we see, number one, slavery ended, but exploitation didn't end. Political domination didn't end.
yeah,
Subordination didn't end. That's number one. Number two, uh, many of the people who got rich during slavery, mainly white men, they
yeah,
became far richer under imperialism. So
yeah,
exploitation didn't end. Number three, racism didn't end. During slavery, it was biological racism, it was
yeah,
religious racism. That continued, but also it was supported by eugenics and Darwinism. And we know the way eugenics was used in Liverpool to create this despicable concept of so-called half-caste. Okay. But the most important thing about imperialism for me is we have far more information written by Africans, by West Indians, and by Liverpool-born blacks.
yeah,
For example, Edward Wilmot Blyden, one of the fathers of African nationalism, he spent several months in Liverpool in the 1890s. Nobody told us that. So I want to know, what was he doing? What was going on? So the important thing in imperialism is we can find out more about what black people were doing and saying when Liverpool dominated West African trade. Let me give you one other example. In the 1880s, Europeans controlled 5% of Africa. By the 1920s, they controlled 95%. So if we want to know what they were doing in Africa, we'll get far more from this period. But again, the most important thing is black voices. Edward Wilmot Blyden. Marcus Garvey came through Liverpool on his way to London.
great
Du
man.
Bois came through Liverpool. Nkrumah came through Liverpool. Nkrumah stayed at the African Church's mission. Ezekwe, the first president and prime minister of Nigeria. These people came through, and we need to get those people documented so we can hear black voices. People are working on Dorothy Kuya's archive. She was born in the 30s, so that's a bit later. But there's a lot of information there, and this is the way to decolonize history. And we need resources from people who are interested in a more accurate history to develop it. So let me leave it there. Let me thank you for the interview. Thank you for sharing your experiences in Egypt. I can see you feel regenerated and rejuvenated. And
Definitely.
I look forward to talking more about that.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Small. This is James Diboe on Discovering, dedicated to original peoples as always. And, we're going to finish off now. And that's been a great discussion. And I feel that we've even gone a bit deeper than even last time we discussed. But, there's always more stuff for us to cover. And I'm looking forward to you appearing on the documentary Original Peoples very soon. Thank you very much, Professor.
I'll do that.
And you enjoy yourself. You have a good day.
Okay.
Bless. Peace.
Thanks. So
Thanks very much.